And happy Sunday from Philadelphia. Frank here with yet another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. More news coming in the last week, enough to justify doing another show, and we're certainly glad about that. A very interesting week, a continued fallout from the New York Times story from a couple of weeks ago. Blumenthal and Keene were able to do a follow-up this past week, which I'm going to discuss in a little bit of detail and qualify and be a little critical of some of the things that they had to say. Also, this morning, Christopher Mellon appeared on the Smirkanish show on CNN, talked a little bit more about crash retrievals when asked about it. And also in the news in the last week, the Scientific American published a story by a couple of scientists in which they called for more scientific study of the UFO issue. So it was a very interesting week, and of course I'll wrap up with a review of episode 4 of the Unidentified show. And let me make a quick fix on that. Hang on here. Episode 4, not episode 5. Okay, hang on a sec. So there we go. A little quick fix on that, and let's get right to it and start talking about the New York Times story. Of course, a big story, not this past week, but the week before, about the crash retrieval issue. And Keene and Blumenthal did follow up this week. And the headline of their story read, "Do we believe in UFOs? That's the wrong question." So let me go through some key elements in the story here. We're often asked by well-meaning associates and readers, do you believe in UFOs? The question sets us aback as being inappropriately personal. What? Okay, well, okay. You put the material out there, so I'm not so sure about that. I don't know why it would be inappropriately personal. It's a fair question. At times, reporters are particularly averse to revealing opinions that could imply possible reporting bias. Well, you look at Leslie Keene's entire career of writing books about UFOs, being closely involved with Bud Hopkins, of currently getting a book published on near-death experiences. So, what are we talking about here? Her entire career indicates, I wouldn't say a bias in a negative sense, but a deep interest in the paranormal. So it's like, come on, what are you talking about here? But going back to the article, but in this case, we have no problem responding, no, we don't believe in UFOs, which again seems like, who wrote this? Are you kidding here? What are we talking about? Of course, UFOs, unidentified flying objects, in the strictest sense of the definition, is any kind of flying object that you don't know what it is. Of course, I do agree that the question, do you believe in UFOs, is not the best question. Of course, really the best question is, do you think or do you believe that some UFOs are ET? That's really, really the $64,000 question here, isn't it? So, yeah, I would kind of disagree with the framing so far. Again, Keene and Blumenthal go on. As we see it, their existence or non-existence is not a matter of belief. That's what the Pentagon UFO program has been focusing on, making it eminently newsworthy. I'm not sure what sense that even makes. If anything, I think Marco Rubio was pretty clear in his interview last week that he's quite convinced that these videos captured of objects flying, that they don't know who is piloting them, that the radar and all that, they're unidentified flying objects. It's not a question of are they real? Do you believe in them or not? Yeah, they're unidentified flying objects. So again, I kind of don't know what they're talking about here. But okay, and to be clear, going back to the quote, UFOs don't mean aliens. Well, they might not, and of course, a lot of UFO cases do get explained as being perfectly natural or man-made objects floating around in the sky, whatever the case may be. But that is what we're here for, isn't it? All you UFO buffs. That's, again, the $64,000 question. Are some of these UFOs ET? And, of course, the answer for me is, yeah, I think some of them are. Do I believe it? Well, okay, belief is a pretty high bar, but I absolutely think some of them might very well be. I can't point to a particular case and say, yeah, that's it, 100%. But I think over time, enough of these truly extraordinary cases where there are credible witnesses, not infrequently backed up by physical evidence in the form of radar. Yeah, I think you put those together into a pile, and you put enough of them together, and yeah, I think some of those cases in that pile, in that big pile of cases that fit those characteristics, that's where you'll find the ETs if they're there. And yeah, I do think they're there. So I've been doing this long enough, and that's what I think. Okay, and I'm not the least bit concerned about saying it. So unidentified means we don't know what they are, only that they demonstrate capabilities that do not appear to be possible through currently available technology. It was nice to see a follow-up. It always gets more attention, especially in the New York Times, but honestly, it was kind of a throwaway article. We want a little bit more in the way of details here, and we really didn't get too much of that in this particular article. But it leads me to talk about a little bit of research that was done back in the day by someone who actually worked with Leslie Kean's old boyfriend, John Mack. Now, John Mack, of course, was working at Harvard. He was a psychology professor, or was it psychiatry? I'm not sure which. And he suddenly got interested in the abductee, contactee phenomenon, decided to take a closer look. But being an academic, being a smart guy, he had some resources and sought out some advice before he decided to get into this whole hog. And the person that he went to, he was a very lucky guy because he had access to a very esteemed scientist, someone by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who is the author of the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in fact, you likely have heard or used the expression paradigm shift, meaning just a huge, significant change in the way the world is and our thinking within it. And Kuhn is the guy who coined that phrase in terms of scientific revolutions, paradigm shift. That means a big change, and quite possibly a paradigm shift seems to be in process in regarding UFOs. But anyway, regardless of all that, Mack did an interview a few years back where he talked about his approach of Kuhn, and this is the advice that Kuhn gave him. When I started doing this work, I went to see him, meaning Kuhn, and he was interested. He cautioned me in various ways. He advised me to just collect data, to try to suspend judgment, and look out for the traps of language, like real, unreal, exists, doesn't exist, happened, didn't happen, intrapsychic, outside. He advised me to just report, to record what people were feeling and saying, and that's what I've tried to do. And that is really, really good advice. And goes on a little bit more. He got a little bit more advice. The other thing that he said was don't worry about science, because in this culture, science has become a new kind of theology. What you're really interested in, he said, is trying to learn something and gain knowledge, whether it'll satisfy science or not. Science prefers to study primarily within the purely material world, he said, but don't worry about that. And again, that is really good advice. I read this little interview a number of years ago and have said on the show, that's what we're trying to do here, trying to gain knowledge about UFOs. And of course, in our case, we'll go ahead and share it openly and make it available for everybody. But anybody who's taking a closer look at this UFO field should keep this advice in mind. Do a screenshot, save this meme, ask me for it, I'll send it to you, and keep that in mind and sort of use that as a bit of a guidepost in terms of going forward. I think we're going to see a lot of language trap arguments as we move forward in this UFO stuff, as we go through this UFO paradigm shift, and that is what we're going through. And keep it in mind, avoid those traps of language. Yeah, sometimes you do get into them, but I'm telling you, don't get trapped by it. Clear things up and move along quickly. That's my advice. So I'm going to move along quickly to the next little story that we've got. But again, keep Kuhn's advice in mind. We're looking to gain knowledge, and whether it'll satisfy science or your parents or the people you work with or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your wife or your husband or your next door neighbor, who cares? Just try to keep on gaining knowledge about UFOs. That's my advice, taken from the core bit of advice that Kuhn gave Mack a number of years ago. This morning, pleasantly surprised to see that Christopher Mellon appeared on the Smirkanish show in CNN. I've been familiar with Smirkanish for a lot of years. He's a Philly guy, has been broadcasting out of Philadelphia for some time, doing the talk radio and political analysis stuff. He's on CNN. I guess he's on Sirius Radio as well. I don't get that, but he's been around a while. He's a pretty grounded guy. I certainly don't mind listening to him as far as a mainstream media talking head. So it was nice to see him have Mellon on this morning, Christopher Mellon. And let's go to the highlights. It's like a 5.5 minute interview, a nice little chunk of time to spend with Mellon. And of course, Mellon did go through a few different things related to the UFO topic in general. But obviously, Smirkanish has done his homework and is aware of the crash retrieval story and decided to follow up with Mellon on that. And that is the key part of the interview. So let's play the audio on that now.
I was quoting Eric Davis. I know you're familiar with his work when I read that New York Times paragraph a moment ago. Do you believe that there are objects in our possession, broadly defined, our possession, that are from something other than this Earth?
What I will say about that is that I think that assertion should be taken seriously. I'm aware of, I know Eric very well. I understand his arguments. I was present at his briefings on the Hill, and he tried to provide some leads for them to follow to enable them potentially to confirm this. It is an issue that should be taken seriously. In fact, curiously, President Trump himself on Father's Day indicated on air while being filmed that he did have classified information about Roswell, New Mexico, which is, as most people know, is the legendary site of an alleged crash of a UFO. And when asked by his son about that, about declassifying it, he said, "I'll have to think about it." I don't know what there is about Roswell that could be classified or interesting other than that one particular issue. So there is a lot of new press and new information coming forward. And again, as I said, I think this is a topic that the oversight committees should take seriously and investigate.
Well, it was certainly very interesting that Mellon brought up the R word, Roswell. He talked about crash retrievals, and he talked a little bit about the nature of Eric Davis's testimony before congressional staffers, senators, perhaps. We don't know the makeup of the folks that he talked to. Could have been just staffers, could have been senators, could have been congresspeople. We really don't know. We don't have those details. There was some questioning whether or not he had actually done that at all, but in fact, that has proven to be the case now, confirmed by Mellon, and I'd certainly accepted that, didn't have any problems with that. He's been saying these types of things for some time, and apparently, based on what we know Davis has said in open interviews, and we know what Mellon has said here, is that neither of them really have any specific knowledge of any particular crash or any particular crash retrieval program, just that such a thing exists, and it doesn't really seem to go any further than that. A while back, I can't remember if it was last year or perhaps a year before, Davis talked in sort of broad terms, not being able to point to a specific crash retrieval, but talking about Roswell being a good bet. He also had mentioned a crash, a purported crash in Del Rio. That was jumped on by Kevin Randall, who looked into that case a little bit more closely and found that an individual, I believe his name was Billingham. In fact, it was sort of a tall tale from this guy, and nothing came of it. Davis sort of threw that out there as an aside, as a possibility, and Randall jumped all over him and has been very critical of Davis since then. I don't know how fair. I don't think that criticism is especially fair, but both Davis, Mellon, the New York Times, they're talking about crash retrievals, and the R word has come up, and of course we like the R word here. Definitely do think there was something to all that Roswell stuff, and we will keep an eye on all that as it continues. Now, looking for these crash retrieval programs can be a little bit daunting, and I suppose there are a few different ways you can look. Mellon had reported in the interview today that Davis provided these congressional personnel with leads on where they might look, and of course, we've got leads here too. Where might you look for crash retrieval programs? Of course, it's been talked about from a lot of, I think, some of the more speculative and not necessarily reasonable speculation coming from some camps like Richard Dolan, as far as these programs being purely moved over into the private sector as a way of privatizing them properly and once and for all. I don't think that's the case, but there are two different ways to look at it. You can look at it from the outside in. You can look at these defense contractors and then sort of trace it back to the inside. It's they've got to get this material from somewhere. They don't have their crash retrieval programs, so it's got to come from the military. Or do you look at it from the inside out? We'll take a look right now from the inside out, and who might be some of the key players involved in this type of crash retrieval work. Obviously, DARPA would be one of those, right at the top of the list, as a matter of fact. With DARPA, that is, of course, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they develop emerging technologies for use by the military. Then over on the Air Force side, you have, of course, the Air Force Materiel Command, which going back in the day, they oversaw Project Blue Book. What they do is research, develop, test, evaluate, acquire, maintenance, and do program management of existing and future Air Force weapon systems and their components. And then, of course, they have their own lab underneath them, the Air Force Research Laboratory. That's a scientific research organization operated by the Air Materiel Command, and they lead on discovery, development, and integration of aerospace warfighting technologies, planning and executing Air Force science and technology programs, and provide warfighting capabilities to the U.S. Air, Space, and Cyberspace Forces. And then on the Navy side, the Office of Naval Research. It's an organization within the Department of the Navy responsible for the science and technology programs of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And then under them, they've got their Naval Research Laboratory, and that is a research laboratory that conducts scientific research, applied research, technological development, and prototyping, and specializes in plasma physics, space physics, material sciences, and tactical electronic warfare. So that's what they do, and those are some of the names that might turn up in the future if more details come out as far as any kind of crash retrieval, any kind of ET reverse engineering programs. That's on the inside, working its way out towards corporate. And as far as corporate is concerned, because of the silliness surrounding the Wilson Davis notes, there's been a lot of talk about different defense contractors, really more on the manufacturing side, Lockheed Martin. Let's see, who else is there? There's Grumman Northrop, or Northrop Grumman, I should say, and those types of companies. But there were also, and I went into a lot of detail about this on earlier shows, there are also a lot of research institutes out there that might, depending on what's in hand, they might well be among the contractors used, not necessarily a manufacturing contractor, but a research facility like the Battelle Memorial Institute, which has been reported is still doing work on UFOs at least up into the 70s. So there's that. So keep an eye on those organizations and see what they're going to be working on, and they might well, their names might well come up as we find out a little bit more about possible crash retrieval. Of course, again, we're also hearing some stories about fully intact craft of an ET nature. How would something like that get here? Well, I suppose maybe the same way that a fully functional MiG might deliver itself to the United States, that some ET decided to defect, or that they landed something, the pilot hopped out, climbed aboard another ship, and went back with the mothership and left a fully intact craft to be recovered. Those are speculative tales. Don't necessarily believe that stuff, but if you're talking about something that's fully functional, I don't see any other way for that to fall into our hands. But I think by and large, we're talking about debris here, literal wrecks. So that's what we're talking about. And if that's the case, I think those are the players that you're going to want to be taking a closer look at. Also this week, a very interesting article from Scientific American. They don't write much about the UFO stuff. There was an interview with Steve Justice a couple of years back, right after the original New York Times article came out, all the way back in December of 2017, and that article came out maybe within a couple months of that or so. But here's another one. We've got a couple of scientists here writing for Scientific American. One of them, Ravi Kumar Koparapu, who is a research scientist for NASA, and Jacob Haq Misra, who is an astrobiologist, and they're writing in Scientific American that they think that it's about time for a little bit more scientific research on UFOs. In the article, they write, what should be the approach? If a scientific approach is desired, one needs an interdisciplinary approach to address the combined observational characteristics of UAP rather than isolating one aspect of the event. Furthermore, UAP phenomenon are not U.S.-specific events. They are a worldwide occurrence. Several other countries studied them, so shouldn't we as scientists choose to investigate and curb the speculation around them? Of course, I certainly agree with that, and the interdisciplinary approach is very important. And we're also going to have to go, I think, beyond the realm of just the physical sciences as well, and some historians are going to have to get involved because there is little question in my mind there is a genuine untold history regarding UFOs and what's gone on within the government. But getting back to the article, a systematic investigation is essential in order to bring the phenomenon into mainstream science. First, collection of hard data is paramount to establishing any credibility to the explanation of the phenomenon. A rigorous scientific analysis is sorely needed by multiple independent study groups, just as we do for evaluating other scientific discoveries. We as scientists cannot hastily dismiss any phenomenon without in-depth examination and then conclude the event itself is unscientific. The transient nature of UAP events, and hence the unpredictability about when and where the next event will happen, is likely one of the main reasons why UAP have not been taken seriously in science circles. But how can one identify a pattern without systematically collecting the data in the first place? In astronomy, the observations, location, and timing of gamma ray bursts, supernova, and gravitational waves are similarly unpredictable. However, we now recognize them as natural phenomenon arising from stellar evolution. So some great points made there. Some caveats, though. I think that some of these scientists are thinking, well, they just go in and flash my PhD to the military, and I'm going to be getting all their reports, all the hard physical evidence that they have gathered, for example, remote sensing in the form of radar and FLIR video. That is not going to happen, and that is going to be a difficult road to hoe, but it's nice to see more scientists getting interested in this and writing about it. They make some excellent points here. But other scientists have taken a look and have been interested before. And let's cover this a little bit first, because this is a very interesting anecdotal case that a lot of you might not be familiar with regarding mapping of the ocean floor. U.S. Navy secrecy likely stalled ocean science progress for decades. Okay, now you think they're going to just easily give up UFO data? Let's look at this particular instance and see. They didn't give up this data too easily, and really, I mean, what was the reason for this being classified? So let's go through the details. To the article. Beginning in the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy took an active interest in pursuing ocean research for military purposes. In doing so, the Navy reshaped the field in America, focusing most of its research on studying the physical characteristics of the ocean, such as using sonar to map the ocean floor, rather than on exploring biological or chemical oceanography, or escased. Up until around 1938, scientists in the U.S. were exploring the fundamentals of what would eventually become the theory of plate tectonics, which recognizes the rigidity of the outer layer of the Earth, the crust, links volcanism and earthquakes to crustal motion, and even estimates its rate of movement. All that progress came to a halt with World War II. And scientists who signed on to work with the U.S. Navy found that not only was their work designated as classified for the duration of the war, the secrecy continued even after the war ended, according to Oreskes. They were forbidden from sharing key oceanographic data, such as bathymetric or depth measurements, with scientists who lacked a security clearance. Limiting ocean data access to only a handful of people on a need-to-know basis greatly reduced the scientific community's chances of seeing important scientific breakthroughs, Oreskes said. Great discoveries are rare, and this policy makes sure they won't be made by the simple procedure of limiting factual information to a few men, she explained. And there you go. I mean, there's, again, just an anecdotal instance, but lots of data gathered by the military, labeled as classified, maybe with good reason in some instances. In this particular instance, I don't understand what possible need for classification there would be in terms of mapping the ocean floor, but there you have it. So yeah, scientists, welcome aboard and get ready for a rough ride. So let's also take a look at some gathering of data that's taken place in the past, the kind of data that I think is especially interesting. This from Professor Peter Sturrock of Stanford University's book, The UFO Enigma, where he talked about gathering together a number of cases from Blue Book and also from a Gepan Sepra, which basically a French organization, and basically they gathered a number of cases. These radar visual cases, these are the key cases, because again, you've got credible witnesses and their testimony is corroborated by physical evidence in the form of radar. The French came up with 101 radar visual cases. Project Blue Book came up with 76. I'm sure that there are more. Obviously, this book was written, I think, the better part of 30 years ago, so a lot has happened since then. How many of these cases are there, and are all of them ET? Probably not. But again, it's that type of database, that kind of collection of cases. We're talking about 177 plus 4 others. So you're talking about roughly 180 cases, give or take. In that pile, are you going to find some ET cases? I think that's where you're going to find that pile, that type of pile, and supplement, obviously, that data with newer data that might be available regarding some other cases that have happened more recently. If we can get it, that's the pile I think that you're going to find those ET cases in. Another study that was not actually taken part of, but it was at least considered by Professor Linus Pauling. I wrote at length about this particular paper from Pauling, just really among his private notes. He outlines a few things that he thinks should be part of a UFO study. A very interesting paper, and any scientist who's going to consider taking a closer look at UFOs should at least take a look at this and cop some ideas from it. Very interesting piece. Certainly talks about witness cases and cases that feature 2 witnesses unrelated to one another viewing the same thing from a couple different locations. Merit some special attention. He also talks about the difficulty in explaining some cases if they do happen to be some sort of advanced military or test aircraft, that you might not be able to get the information to prove that quite readily. Also talks about the possibility of panspermia and a few other things there. It's very interesting. Go over and look for that at my website. I wrote the article about Linus Pauling. You can find that over at ufopartisan.blogspot.com. So go check that out and find out that article and take a look at some of the ideas that Pauling had for a UFO study. And again, I think you'll find that very interesting. And finally, I was able to watch episode 4 of Unidentified. This particular episode, titled A Planetary Threat, posed as a question. And the episode, again, another very solid, very interesting episode. Basically, Elizondo trekked off to South America, talked to a number of high-level people down there, and some witnesses to some very interesting events. They really didn't present within the context of the show anything that I regarded as especially threatening. There have been times when TTSA, I think, has lapsed and talked about a threat here. I guess they've decided that's the strategy. That's what they need to get people's attention about all this, but again, it's tough enough to get people to accept the fact that there really is something to these UFOs. Some of them might well be ET, and then take that leap and say, well, they're a threat. From a strictly aviation point, I've made this point a number of times, going back to the language trap that Kuhn talked about with John Mack, going back to that language trap, the threat word. Yeah, in the context of aviation, really anything that could possibly lead to some kind of an air mishap is regarded as a threat, including birds, including weather. So, a UFO almost by definition could be regarded as a threat in an aviation sense. But beyond that, no, it's not any kind of planetary threat, not any kind of existential threat, not any kind of real threat to the United States or any other country that currently exists on this planet. But that was the title, maybe a little bit cheeky, a little bit misleading. So they didn't really go there during the course of the episode. One thing that did cross my mind, and I did enjoy the episode and did like it, but what we're finding is in this increased heat within the news cycle, and things are happening sort of on a almost daily basis that are really quite interesting. And I don't see any reason that's going to die down anytime soon. I mean, I'm sure it will eventually. We do run hot, cold with all this, but the show itself is to a certain extent almost becoming a bit of an afterthought, that what's going on right here and right now is more interesting than what they've got together on the show. So that's another issue that if there is a season 3, then maybe they might want to have to consider, maybe turn around, increase, or I should say pick up the speed on their turnaround time and do things a little bit more in the moment, because I mean, when your show is kind of getting its doors blown off by much more interesting things that are happening in the news cycle, that can be a little bit of a problem. But I will say, John Burroughs asked me this week if what was the story with the ratings on Unidentified, and I really haven't been keeping track, but I was curious and did decide to give it a quick look up. And not this week, obviously the ratings aren't in for this week, but last week's episode was in the top 10. Regarding original cable shows for last week, so or at least on that particular day. So it was in the top 10, so it is getting some attention. I don't know if Saturday night is necessarily the best night for TV watching, but at least compared to its competition, comparing apples to apples and Saturday night shows, it was in the top 10. And obviously there's an awful lot out there on cable TV these days, so it seems to be holding its own. And I don't know if we'll get a season 3 or not, but so far I definitely do like the show, roughly halfway through its run at this point, 4 episodes in, and we'll see what they've got the rest of the way. So that's about all I've got for tonight for you. Really enjoyed it. It was a quick, easy show to do. We didn't get too complicated, and hopefully the news keeps coming and I can do these more often. So you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll be back as soon as I've got something to talk about. Have a good one. Bye-bye now.